What drives a man who already held the most powerful office in the world to still crave a prize he cannot command? Is it about peace, or is it about the power of being remembered as history's chosen peacemaker? It begins with a question that pierces through the noise of politics and forces reflection. What does it mean when a leader seems to yearn for the Nobel Peace Prize with more intensity than the very ideals of peace it represents? Such a question immediately sets the stage for understanding the psychology and ambition behind the pursuit of an award that is globally recognized as the pinnacle of diplomatic achievement. The Nobel Prize has never been merely a medal. It is a symbol, a powerful emblem of moral authority and international validation. For generations, its aura has been so profound that leaders, activists, and even entire nations have treated it as a marker of legitimacy in the eyes of history. Beginning with this hook invites the audience to think not only about the prize itself, but also about the kind of desire it awakens in those who covet it. A powerful hook functions like the spark that lights the fire of curiosity. It forces the listener to stop, pay attention, and ask themselves whether the hunger for recognition is as consequential as the pursuit of actual progress. In politics, words often fade quickly, but a well-placed, thought-provoking question has the ability to linger in the mind long after the speech is over. It places the audience in a position of judgment, compelling them to weigh the difference between ambition and achievement. By suggesting that the prize might be desired more for its prestige than for the values it celebrates, the hook challenges the very motives of leadership. This framing turns the discussion into more than an exploration of one man's ambition. It becomes a broader commentary on how leaders chase symbols of greatness to cement their place in history. Such a beginning also captures the contradiction between substance and spectacle. The Nobel Prize is awarded for advancing peace, but when the hunger for recognition eclipses the work of reconciliation, the symbol risks overshadowing the cause. The hook deliberately stirs this tension, prompting the audience to look deeper than announcements or headlines, and to question what is truly at stake. Is it about the hard, quiet labor of diplomacy, or is it about the applause that follows the photo opportunities? By opening with a question that juxtaposes the desire for the award with the reality of peace itself, the speech ensures that the theme is set with sharp clarity. This is not merely a conversation about global politics, but about human ambition, ego, and the universal craving for validation. The fascination with the Nobel Peace Prize did not surface in passing. It was a recurring theme, woven into Donald Trump's rhetoric throughout his presidency and beyond. At rallies, during interviews, and even in offhand remarks from the White House, he often circled back to the idea that he deserved the honor. This was not framed as a casual thought or a fleeting wish, but rather as an assertion that demanded recognition. For him, the Nobel was more than an award. It was a symbol of fairness, proof that his leadership was acknowledged not only by his supporters at home, but by the international community he so often criticized. The intensity with which he raised the subject made it clear that he saw the prize as the ultimate validation of his presidency, something that could silence critics and enshrine his legacy in a way no domestic achievement could. The repetition of his remarks on the prize reveals an underlying sense of grievance. Trump often cast himself as a man wronged by elites, dismissed by institutions, and underappreciated for what he considered groundbreaking accomplishments. By invoking the Nobel Peace Prize, he sought to highlight what he viewed as a glaring inconsistency, that world leaders who had done less, or even nothing tangible in his view, had been honored while he was overlooked. This grievance narrative was central to his appeal, and the Nobel became another battlefield in his larger fight for legitimacy. His insistence on deserving the award was not just about the work he claimed to have done, but about the perception that he was being deliberately denied credit. In political terms, raising the idea of the Nobel Peace Prize also served a strategic purpose. It allowed him to position himself as a statesman on the world stage, a man who had moved beyond partisan squabbles to pursue outcomes with global significance. Whether speaking of his dealings with North Korea or his role in Middle East agreements, the invocation of the Nobel Prize elevated those actions from policy initiatives to supposedly historic achievements. By doing so, he aimed to reinforce the notion that his presidency was not only consequential, but transformative. This consistent focus on the prize illustrates that for Trump, recognition was inseparable from accomplishment, and the Nobel was the most prestigious recognition imaginable. When Trump defended his claim to the Nobel Peace Prize, he consistently pointed to what he described as his landmark achievements in foreign policy. Chief among these was the signing of the Abraham Accords, agreements that normalized diplomatic relations between Israel and several Arab states, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. To his supporters, this was a remarkable breakthrough in a region where tensions and hostilities had shaped decades of policy failures. The accords were framed not only as peace agreements, but as a reordering of Middle Eastern politics, a new chapter in which former adversaries chose dialogue and commerce over conflict. Trump frequently cited these deals as evidence that he had delivered genuine peace outcomes where others had failed, insisting that such progress should have automatically qualified him for international recognition. Alongside the Abraham Accords, he also placed great emphasis on his personal diplomacy with North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un. At a time when nuclear tensions were at a dangerous peak, Trump took the unprecedented step of meeting directly with the North Korean dictator. He highlighted the historic summits in Singapore and Hanoi as moments when the threat of war was significantly reduced. Although critics argued that the meetings produced little in terms of verifiable disarmament, Trump maintained that the very act of bringing both nations to the table represented a monumental step toward peace. In his telling, he had defied decades of conventional wisdom and opened a path toward stability on the Korean peninsula, something no other American president had achieved. By underscoring these achievements, Trump sought to build a narrative of himself as a peacemaker in a world of conflict. He contrasted his actions with what he often portrayed as endless wars and failed negotiations under past administrations. The Abraham Accords and the North Korea summits were not simply foreign policy highlights. They were, in his view, transformative events that changed the global landscape. This framing allowed him to argue that his legacy went beyond domestic politics and partisan divides, reaching into the realm of global statesmanship. The Nobel Prize, in his eyes, was the natural acknowledgement of these accomplishments, the crowning symbol that the world had been reshaped through his leadership. Trump's repeated comparisons with previous Nobel Peace Prize winners reveal much about his mindset and his pursuit of recognition. He often singled out examples from history where leaders were awarded the prize for efforts he viewed as symbolic rather than substantive. Most notably, he highlighted the case of Barack Obama, who received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2009, just months into his presidency. Trump criticized that decision openly, arguing that Obama had been granted the honor before achieving any meaningful diplomatic progress. To Trump, this set a precedent that was not only unfair but deeply revealing of what he believed to be bias within the international establishment. By drawing this comparison, he framed his own candidacy for the prize as more deserving, rooted in concrete actions rather than promises or symbolic gestures. This contrast allowed him to construct a narrative in which he was not only overlooked but actively denied recognition that others had received with far less merit. In his telling, the Abraham Accords and the North Korean summits were substantive accomplishments that had shifted the global balance towards stability, while past recipients had been rewarded for rhetoric, aspirations, or minimal achievements. By invoking these examples, he reinforced the perception that he was being treated unfairly by global institutions that were unwilling to grant him legitimacy. This sense of being wronged was central to his broader political identity, in which he cast himself as an outsider battling entrenched elites who refused to acknowledge his successes. The act of comparison also carried political weight with his supporters. By insisting that he deserved the Nobel more than past recipients, he appealed to their sense of grievance and validation. Many of his followers shared his skepticism toward international bodies and saw the Nobel Committee as part of the same establishment that criticized his presidency. Thus, his comparisons were not only about his personal desire for recognition, but also about reinforcing the worldview that he and his base held in common. Ultimately, by contrasting himself with others, Trump framed his case not as a plea for recognition, but as a demand for fairness. He wanted the world to see that if others had been honored for less, then his own tangible contributions to diplomacy made him an undeniable candidate. This constant juxtaposition served to highlight both his ambitions and his frustrations, painting a picture of a leader who believed he had been unjustly denied the validation that history had readily given to others. For Trump, the Nobel Peace Prize represented far more than a medal awarded in Oslo. It symbolized the ultimate seal of approval from the global order he so often critiqued. Throughout his presidency, he positioned himself as a challenger to international institutions, questioning alliances, criticizing multilateral organizations, and embracing a rhetoric of sovereignty over globalism. Yet, when it came to the Nobel Prize, his tone shifted. He saw in it a form of validation that no election victory or domestic policy could deliver. To receive such recognition would mean acknowledgement from the very elite establishment he frequently denounced, a paradox that reveals much about the complexity of his ambition. In Trump's worldview, legitimacy was tied not only to power at home, but to acknowledgement abroad. He believed his actions on the world stage, the Abraham Accords, the meetings with North Korea, and pressure campaigns on NATO allies were transformative, even if controversial, but achievements without recognition remained, in his eyes, incomplete. The Nobel Prize was the pinnacle of recognition, the kind of symbolic stamp that could not be dismissed by critics or historians. To hold it would be to force even those who opposed him to admit his significance, to immortalize his name in the company of global figures remembered for fostering peace. The prize also carried an element of personal vindication. Trump often described himself as misunderstood or misrepresented by the media, the political class, and the international community. Winning the Nobel would be proof that, despite criticism, his approach to leadership had yielded undeniable results. It would serve as evidence that disruption, strength, and unconventional diplomacy were not only effective but worthy of global admiration. This longing for external affirmation underscores how much he valued the symbolic power of the award, even as he derided the institutions behind it. Beyond personal pride, the Nobel Prize represented a narrative tool. It was a way to reshape his image, shifting focus from division at home to achievement abroad. It could recast him not merely as a populist politician, but as a statesman of historic consequence. For someone who has always been acutely aware of brand status and legacy, the Nobel was the ultimate brand enhancer, a credential that would transcend politics and cement his place in history. In this sense, the prize was not just about peace, but about power, the power to define how he would be remembered on the global stage. Trump's pursuit of the Nobel Peace Prize cannot be separated from his deep concern with legacy. From the earliest days of his presidency, he demonstrated an awareness of how history books would record his time in office. The prize, with its long tradition of celebrating figures who reshaped the world, offered a pathway to secure his place among leaders remembered not only for power, but for lasting contributions to humanity. In this way, it was not simply about recognition in the present, but about cementing a narrative that future generations would revisit. He often described his accomplishments as historic and unprecedented, and winning the Nobel would have provided the ultimate confirmation of that self-image. The pursuit of legacy was particularly important because his presidency was marked by division, controversy, and constant conflict with opponents both domestically and abroad. Against this backdrop, the Nobel Prize offered a counterbalance. It was a way to craft an alternative story, one in which he was not merely a polarizing political figure, but a peacemaker of global significance. This duality reveals how central the notion of legacy was to his ambitions. If critics sought to define him through turmoil and confrontation, he could point to the Nobel as proof of his role in shaping peace. The prize, therefore, was more than an honor. It was a narrative weapon in the battle over how history would judge him. The emphasis on legacy also speaks to Trump's acute understanding of branding. Throughout his career, whether in business, television, or politics, he cultivated an image of success and influence. The Nobel Prize would extend that brand into a domain that transcended national borders, granting him entry into an elite global circle of figures whose names carry moral and historical weight. In his view, being counted alongside leaders like Nelson Mandela or Mikhail Gorbachev would elevate his persona far beyond partisan politics, giving him the universal prestige he felt was rightfully his. Legacy, in Trump's case, was about more than memory. It was about immortality in the political and historical imagination. The Nobel Prize represented a shortcut to that immortality, an achievement that no impeachment, scandal or criticism could erase. To hold it would be to secure his place in the annals of history, not just as a president who disrupted the system, but as one who redefined global diplomacy in ways that demanded recognition for generations to come. The irony in Trump's desire for the Nobel Peace Prize lies in the nature of the award itself. Unlike elections, which can be won through rallies, campaigns, and persuasion, the Nobel is determined by an international committee that values consensus, diplomacy, and the perception of selfless service to peace. It cannot be claimed through force of will, nor can it be demanded as a right. It is an honor that arrives only when the global community collectively agrees that someone's contributions transcend politics and embody the ideals of reconciliation and harmony. Trump's approach, however, was often centered on asserting that he deserved recognition, a strategy that clashed with the ethos of the prize. His relentless emphasis on his achievements, while politically effective with his supporters, ran counter to the quiet humility and broad acceptance usually associated with Nobel laureates. This paradox illustrates the tension between ambition and acknowledgement. On one hand, Trump pursued bold diplomatic gestures, such as the Abraham Accords and his summits with North Korea, and he promoted these as world-changing milestones. On the other, his method of seeking the Nobel, by repeatedly reminding audiences that he should win it, created the impression that he valued the symbol of peace more than the substance. The Nobel is not a reward for wanting peace or even claiming to achieve it. It is a recognition granted when others agree that genuine, lasting change has been accomplished. By making the pursuit so public and personal, he risked turning what could have been viewed as significant progress into what critics saw as a campaign for validation. The paradox deepens when considering how his rhetoric often contrasted with the values the Nobel Prize embodies. At times, his speeches and policies emphasized confrontation, nationalism, and the use of pressure rather than dialogue. This raised questions about whether his vision of peace aligned with the committee's standards, which typically celebrate leaders who bridge divides through cooperation and compromise. The gap between his style and the committee's expectations highlighted why ambition alone could not secure the award. In essence, the Nobel Peace Prize is not won by self-promotion but by consensus. It requires others, often skeptics and adversaries, to acknowledge the contribution. For Trump, this dynamic created a dilemma. He could not compel recognition as he might in politics or business. Instead, he had to rely on a form of global agreement that was elusive to him, making the prize both tantalizingly close and frustratingly out of reach. Despite the fact that Trump received several nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize, the award never materialized, and the reasons for this are tied to the very nature of his leadership. His diplomatic efforts, while groundbreaking in some respects, were often viewed as incomplete or lacking the long-term stability that the Nobel Committee tends to reward. The Abraham Accords, though historic, were criticized for being limited in scope, leaving the central issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict unresolved. Similarly, the meetings with North Korea, while dramatic and unprecedented, failed to produce verifiable steps toward denuclearization. To the committee, symbolic breakthroughs without lasting, concrete outcomes may not have met the high threshold required for the prize. Another factor was the global perception of Trump's governing style. His presidency was marked by confrontational rhetoric, abrupt policy shifts, and a tendency to alienate traditional allies while embracing adversarial leaders. The Nobel Prize is often awarded to figures who embody unity, reconciliation, and bridge building, qualities that critics argued were absent from much of Trump's approach. His America First philosophy, though appealing to his supporters domestically, often clashed with the multilateral spirit celebrated by the Nobel Committee. This contrast between his nationalist tone and the committee's internationalist values created a barrier that no amount of nomination letters could easily overcome. The divisive nature of his leadership also played a role. Nobel laureates are expected to inspire broad admiration across borders and political divides. Trump, however, was one of the most polarizing figures in modern history, both at home and abroad. For every supporter who hailed him as a disruptor of stagnant diplomacy, there were critics who saw him as a destabilizing force. Such polarization made it difficult for the committee to view him as a unifying figure deserving of the title of peacemaker. Timing also worked against him. The Nobel Committee often waits to see whether peace efforts stand the test of time before conferring the award. In Trump's case, many of his diplomatic initiatives were too recent or fragile to be judged successful. Without evidence of durability, the committee was unlikely to act. The combination of incomplete achievements, divisive rhetoric, and global skepticism ensured that his nominations, while notable, never translated into the recognition he so openly sought. Trump's repeated pursuit of the Nobel Peace Prize revealed something deeper than a desire for accolades. It exposed a hunger for recognition that went beyond politics and into the realm of personal validation. From his earliest days as a businessman, he crafted an image of success that relied heavily on public acknowledgement, branding, and the perception of victory. The Nobel, in this sense, was the ultimate symbol of global acknowledgement, a prize that would affirm not just his policies, but his very identity as a leader of consequence. By striving for it so openly, he revealed how much he valued the approval of institutions he otherwise criticized, showing that even as he railed against international elites, he still longed for their acceptance. The pursuit also highlighted the paradox of his political style. He positioned himself as an outsider who challenged the establishment, yet he craved recognition from the most prestigious establishment institution of all. This tension underscored the complexity of his character, a leader who thrived on defiance, but also sought validation from the very authorities he dismissed. To his supporters, this was not contradictory, but proof of his greatness. He had, in their eyes, earned the Nobel and was being unfairly denied it by a biased system. To his critics, it was a demonstration of ego, showing that he valued applause more than the hard, quiet labor of diplomacy. At its core, the yearning for the Nobel Prize symbolized Trump's broader pursuit of immortality through legacy. He often described his achievements in superlatives: the greatest, the biggest, the most historic, language that revealed his desire to be remembered not just as a president, but as a figure of global significance. The Nobel Prize would serve as an eternal marker of that legacy, ensuring that his name would be etched into history alongside the most revered peacemakers. His focus on it reflected a belief that achievements without recognition were incomplete. That history could only truly validate him if it bore the signature of the Nobel Committee. What emerges from this desire is a portrait of a leader whose ambitions were as much about perception as they were about outcomes. The hunger for recognition, embodied in the pursuit of the Nobel, illustrates a deep need for affirmation, one that shaped not only his diplomacy, but also the way he wanted the world to remember him. In the end, Trump's pursuit of the Nobel Peace Prize was never just about diplomacy or deals. It was about recognition, validation, and the legacy he hoped to leave behind. The prize became a mirror of his ambition, reflecting both his bold claims of achievement and the world's reluctance to endorse them. Whether history views him as a peacemaker or a polarizer, his fixation on the Nobel reveals a deeper truth. For Trump, the struggle for acknowledgement was as important as the struggle for peace itself.